want to start this afternoon's presentation by really focusing on the fact that this project is perhaps the biggest, well, it is the biggest of its kind in the history of street making. We are in a new era in America where everything we do from here on out, but especially with transportation, has to make money. We can't spend money and not end up in a better position. We just can't afford it. There were decades where we were doing something different. So completing the streets allows us to eke out the very highest value of land of any project. So we like to say that completing the streets is really just completing our communities, setting the stage for all the types of prosperity that we've been looking for, but been looking for in the wrong place, just moving further out and so on. Complete streets are about equity, equality, diversity, supporting all modes of travel, and providing more access and not denying access. I like to also say that walkability and livability and complete streets are almost all in the same description. You can't have livability without completing your streets. You can't add value to land without doing that. So if this gentleman assumes that life should be somewhat as he's seen it depicted in these four murals or panels, the reality became something very different because we became so singly focused on just keeping ourselves in motion that we now spend more time in our cars, we drive through meaningless places, we realize we can't afford to maintain basic things like sidewalks, and or we never built them in the first place. And so as we go forward with Woodward Avenue, this can be, should be, I even say must be, the model for the future. That any future transportation project, when we complete it, must increase the value of the adjacent land. Never decrease land value. And it doesn't matter the size or the scale of that road, it needs to set the stage for good development to come in. And until the street reads correctly, behaves correctly, developers can't make good money off of a street. It's the spine of a community. So as we go forward and look at what Woodward's potential is, we need to realize that, one, Woodward's not alone. This is a road in Tallahassee, Florida, where for 16 years I worked with the Florida DOT, and this led to not only horrible, fatal crashes every year, but it also devalued all the land. This is the town-gown connection for the state and the city of Tallahassee. Now Woodward's in a little better shape, but when we look at the edges, we realize that we can't maintain street lamps. A lot of buildings have not been improved for a long time because we really aren't getting all of the value out of the land. So that is going to be our quest to figure out how do we make all this work. So when I think of complete streets, I'm thinking of how do we now come up with communities that work for everyone. And keeping in mind the principle why cities exist in the first place, to maximize exchange. Service, product, and goods, our jobs, and culture, friendship, ideas, knowledge, wisdom, passion, the glue that holds communities together. Jane Jacobs wrote much of her earliest writings when I was still in high school. She figured it out long before most of the planners and others later joined her by saying that all our professions have to work together if we're going to have something that works. And only if we are able to achieve that rich, vibrant environment does innovation occur. And since Woodward Avenue, all of Detroit really, is the home of inspiration and innovation for transportation, this is the place to come back to for going forward. So we're not going to start from scratch. We've been doing this for a while. It turns out that new innovative ideas have been coming from different parts of the country for quite a while. And when they're done right, they improve the health of the nation, the health of the community. And overall, they're getting us away from something that was taking us in a totally different direction. That movement was represented by modernism, an idea that cities no longer were for people. It was something we believed in, that we could make the king, the car the king, and everything would be fine, everything would be modern. But it turned out that it wreaked incredible devastation across the entire land. More so, especially if you live in places that were so embedded in the car culture that you ended up with deep and wide swaths virtually crisscrossing entire cities, as we experience here. I believe that's 8 Mile. I think the important thing, though, is we can no longer afford to rid ourselves of the very value of communities. We've got to bring it back, and we've got to find those oases where this is going to happen the earliest and the best. So overall, we're trying to, when we build complete streets, get away from auto dependency, to have choice, to have a means to switch out between modes frequently during the course of a day. Now, if we're going to do that, we still need to measure capacity. We still need to address capacity. And nothing about complete streets would necessarily take away the opportunity for streets to perform their primary mission, to move freight and people in vehicles. But this is the part that's been missing. If you look through all the transportation guides and indexes and so on, nothing tells you how to measure the success of the street in terms of livability or even performance of the street economically or whatever. Michigan, because it launched into the recession earlier than most other states, came together to realize that the future of the economy rested around placemaking. The Michigan Municipal League, which virtually represents all communities in Michigan, put together the works of 7 different economists to show how important the streetscape of placemaking would be. There are also now many books that are describing in detail how to go about performing this. The Suburban Repair Manual, as an example, gives us something very clear to understand. And then, since 80% of the built America is now said to be this, we have to ask ourselves whether or not we can retrofit this. And the good news, we can. It takes more partnering. It takes both public and private monies working together, and it's impossible for developers to come in and do this alone. Good governance and good visioning is required, but once we do this, land value goes up many, many times. And we also now know from many surveys that about 80% of all Americans want walkable communities. They want livable communities. This is not a secondary thing to them, it's primary. And so as we look at strips, which Woodward Avenue has its share of, we need to know, can we transform those into real place? And I think you can see through the imaging, every single one of these is basically complete in a strip. It's essentially taking something like 12 Mile Road that has very low value on the adjacent properties and gives it an address. It gives it its own character, its own personality, its own opportunity to be multiple, to have the parking that's needed, the green that's needed, all the things that start to create this as a place to come to, not a place to drive through. And, or Birmingham, the other Birmingham, this one's in Alabama. You can see it's basically an abandoned part of the community, but it's an area ripe for reinvestment. And again, identifying where these hot spots should be becomes part of the answer to how do we now prime the pump and get the economy working again. You can see it in Virginia on Fairfax Boulevard. And again, this could be Woodward, couldn't it? Am I right? But you start with the edges, and you work out from the edges toward the center. You keep the traffic moving, and now create more and more opportunity and more life and value to the land, and this is all done with transportation being the prime engine for getting that started. I also like to say that to explain the why of completing the streets, that it's basically going to be the only thing we'll be able to afford in the future. Not more quantity, but more quality. Not driving as far, actually driving less. We also know that we can find other examples in winter cities, for example, Madison, Wisconsin, where they've been working at this for 30 years and they've proven that it can work. We see that in a number of Michigan communities, but I think the other thing we must be very cognizant of, until very recently, the American driver didn't pay much credence to energy efficiency. It was rated number 17 out of the things you look for when you buy a car. And today, all that changed. It's actually changed fairly dramatically. But what this now does is challenges our transportation planning and transportation engineering community to look at things differently than back when they were doing everything to create more and more towns or settlement further and further out. Now that we're coming back to provide continuity and context and meaning to those neighborhoods that we fled through earlier, we basically have the science behind us, rock hard science behind us. For example, trees enhance safety. They don't take away from safety, but there was a time when we were taught in school that trees were going to take human life, and it turns out, statistically, it would be better. Here's something very important. The chart that you see here is measuring the annual vehicle miles traveled by the billions. Thank you, RJ. Something happened right about that point. You can see it as we go to the next chart to get into the detail. The vehicle miles traveled by the billions in America changed the picture dramatically. We are now saying the peak probably happened somewhere around 2007 or 2008. But as we follow this chart out and look at each phase of the trend, this was the growth of traffic up until around 2005. Starting, though, around 1987 to 2012, looking at that entire sector, we see it was coming down. And then we look further, certainly everything trending after 2004, it's actually dropping. And then we look at everything after 2007, it's dropping more. And now, looking at our X and Y generation, it's dropping, it's plummeting. The lifestyles, the demographics in our country are changing.